So I wanted to talk about some of the interesting things that I noticed in this book. So this reminds me stylistically of your last novel that I read. It has it's sort of like aphorisms uh, in between the main narrative. Like in the janitor book, you had these tiny little scenes. Sometimes the janitor would just notice a bullfrog, or sometimes he would have a bad day at work, and sometimes it was just a scene of him punching out. These ones are more complex, but it's like they're larger aphorisms. I will say the character of Elizabeth Hanson, the wife of Gorgeous George in this book, she is probably your best female character in all of your novels and maybe your plays. I only say probably because of the plays. Um, and one thing that I thought was interesting of her, and at first I thought this was a flaw when I was reading it, but I don't know if was an intentional thing. But sometimes she sort of sounds like Stevens with tits, where she has these poetic aphorisms in between everything else. But I think that maybe the narrator coming in, or her just lapsing into some sort of wisdom of some kind.
Well, there's really only two narrators. Well, I mean, there is a sort of an omniscient narrator that narrates the Gorgeous George section, because the Betty Hanson, who's ostensibly the main character, her tale goes forward over about a 5-year period from 1946 to 51. She divorced Gorgeous George in 52, but we find out that they actually met as early as 39 and got married. She was the first wife that he married, and Gorgeous George was probably the most famous wrestler pre-Hulk Hogan that had been, professional wrestler at least. And then we have Gorgeous George's sections. There were 13 chapters that have Betty Hanson speaking, and she speaks her own section. And then we have a dozen sort of either interviews or conversations with Gorgeous George, but he goes back in the other direction. His first, and they interlap, so we have 13 Betty Hanson segments that contain the 12 Gorgeous George segments, but Gorgeous George goes backwards in time from, I think it's 61 or 62. He died in 62, so it's either 61 or 62 is his first section, and his 12th section goes back to 1939 when he met Betty Hanson and they're having a speaking. So Betty appears in one of Gorgeous George's sections, and Gorgeous George appears in I think 4 or 5. Well, maybe he's spoken of. He may not speak, but he's spoken of in most of the Betty sections. And so you have their relationship being going chronologically forward for the reader, but you have them both talking from different ends. So we get her idea of their marriage in the late 40s to the 50s, and his is a longer span, and you just get bits and pieces of it from what he was doing in his other aspects of his life.
When I spoke of the whole Stevens with tits idea, I thought of lines like this. This is the core of self worth and self knowledge, the essential gauge that creates oneself, the nub of identity. That seemed to me to be more in tandem with you or Stevens than it would be Betty Hanson. But there are small little aphorisms in between long conversations. Sometimes she goes on and on about interesting. She's an interesting character too, in that she has internal world, but it doesn't seem like she really speaks her mind, so to speak. Uh, one great scene that stuck with me is she's speaking with a preacher, I think, and he's going on about God and about her own thoughts, and she just smiles at him throughout most of the conversation,
Hmm.
and doesn't really say anything uh, contesting any of his increasingly more idiotic points.
Well, I mean, there are a number of characters that we can get some things from. Even if we just look at her sections, I mean, there's Jacob, who played the butler, the servant to Gorgeous George in Ring before Betty did, and he's there over a 2 or 3 year period, and she seems to be, if not sexually attracted to him, she seems to find him to be a nicer person than Gorgeous George. And there are a number of times during scenes where he's apparently driving the car with the three of them. Gorgeous George is sleeping in the back. Betty's up front in the front seat sleeping, or just sort of zombieing out, and he's driving on, and they're either talking or she's getting ideas about him from him. There's some scenes with her pa and her ma, lowercase m for ma and lowercase p for pa, where uh, we get a little bit of a background. And Betty Hansen, there's not a lot that's known about her. I used a book by John Capuia, I think is his name, which is the first Gorgeous George biography. But initially, I was going to have the Noirchid of the title, because Gorgeous George was called the Human Orchid, and I thought that I wanted to go to a dark side of him. So dark meaning noir. Uh, this was the era of film noir too, the late 40s, early 50s. So thought the dark orchid or the Noirchid, like you had the Black Dahlia, the woman who was killed, Elizabeth Short. So I thought, okay, let me make Gorgeous George the Noirchid. But very quickly, within probably the first day or two of me writing it, and I wanted to have Betty having speaking parts, I said, no, let her be the Noirchid, the dark orchid, the darker side of the two of them. Because Gorgeous George seems to be pretty upfront. He's pretty much the celebrity. He likes doing what he's doing. He puts on this front, and Betty would seem to be the one who would have to be the one who's internalizing things. Now, there's not really a lot known about Betty Hansen. Even reading the Capuia biography of Gorgeous George, you don't really get a sense of whether she was smart or this. We know she comes from Oregon. We know she had a family. I think she had one or two sisters. She met Gorgeous George in 38 or 39. They got married in a ring, and then they took that gimmick around, and they got married like, 50 or 60 times in various arenas around the country. And then she served as his valet once. Jeffries, who was the name that Jacob used. I forget now his real name, Jacob whatever. But and so she quickly became in my mind the way to go to the book, and then the way to go with the book. And then I thought, well, let me use a template for her. And I thought the little girl from Terrence Malick's Days of Heaven would be good, because, and I used a number of the quotes from that character as the de facto epigraphs of the Betty sections, where she's talking, and because that girl, and apparently the actress Linda Manns, was allowed by Malick to just go spouting off for hours and hours. And so Malick culled probably about 10 to 12 minutes of these aphorisms from her hours of recordings. And it's a perfect example of where someone can be poetic offhandedly without having a clue. And I said, Betty sounds to me, or seems to me, would be good if I made Betty sort of like the Linda character. And Linda Manns was her real name. So Linda, she wasn't acting that much. Let's make Betty more like the Linda character from Days of Heaven, talking about George the way Linda Manns does about the Richard Gere character, which is her older brother in that film. And I thought that was a good way to approach it. It gives Betty a run. Betty can be both a dumb bumpkin, which she often is. She can be someone who's spiteful and petty, but there's something gnawing underneath that. Under different circumstances, had she come from a rich family and been sent to a boarding school and educated, she might be quite intelligent. I mean, she seems to be an intelligent character, has the natal intelligence, but life has not been good to her, so she is what she is, and that's a good thing to have tensioning against Gorgeous George.